So, Catherine, I was telling some of the students this morning that we were going to be talking a little bit about your book today.
Yes.
And the title has been puzzling because some people have asked me saying, well, we're going to be talking about political deference in the democratic age, British politics and the constitution from the 18th century to Brexit. But the first thing that people have been asking me about is, what do we mean by deference?
Yes, I mean, obviously enough. I mean, why would anybody spend 5 years of his or her life on such a word? And what does it mean? So basically, if you take the term in itself, deference, in fact, would mean to yield, to refer to somebody. And basically, it's generally used in a way which is a sort of pejorative term nowadays, or paternalistic, and it has become sort of incomprehensible. Because essentially the reason why, the trigger to write the book, was at the time of the Queen's Jubilee in 2012, when I kept on listening or reading articles in the press about the fact that the British were a deferential nation. So in itself, I was thinking to myself, first of all, the British as such, I mean, you are actually mixing a huge amount of nations here, and that those different nations could be deferential was very puzzling to me. And it was even more puzzling because basically I had written my PhD on Walter Bagehot. That's what we discussed yesterday. And I knew that in the English Constitution of Walter Bagehot, Bagehot himself was making a use of the concept of deference, which I thought didn't mean what most people meant by deference, which meant essentially the reason why most journalists and most people today would use deference, it's a way of saying that you defer to the crown, generally speaking. You defer to the fact that Queen Elizabeth II has been such an incredible personality on the throne for more than for more than 60 years, and well, nearly 70 now. And so basically, I thought that it was a pity that the concept in itself would not be retrieved. And so I started working on it, thinking initially that nothing would come out of it. And then realizing that, in fact, there was much more to it than met the eye. And that in the end, I felt that the concept of deference, the way it had been described by Bagehot, was at the heart of the institutions of Britain, in the sense that because there is an uncodified constitution, basically there is no book to which you can refer in order to understand the working of power, that basically you could not have an uncodified structure without having a deferential amount of citizens. And that's how it all started. So if you want, it's a beginning, and I can tell you about the rest if you want.
Okay, but what does it mean? Like, so if I try to explain to an 18-year-old or 15 or 13-year-old, I don't know, what deference really means, what does it mean, basically?
Okay, so I study, I'm an intellectual historian. So basically, in my case, it was taking the concept and trying to understand what it meant throughout various historical moments in the history of Britain from the 18th century to the 21st. Mm-hmm. So basically, if you want, it was not a sort of a history which could be explained with a sort of normal sort of evolution. It was not a sort of Whiggish understanding of the term. It was really taking the history of the histories of deference from the 18th century to the 21st century. So basically, I started the book in the 18th century because what was puzzling to me was the fact that basically in the 18th century, what you've got with a number of thinkers such as Hume or Adam Smith and Burke, you've got with them a certain understanding of authority. So basically, how do you delegate power to an elite? How do you actually have mutual respect? How are you going to actually meet reciprocal obligations? So with Smith, for example, this is going to be possible through commerce, through commercial societies. With Burke, this is going to be possible through traditions. And basically, so I started from there. But the real person who really uses the term deference and who actually makes use of it to illustrate the institutions is Walter Bagehot. So what does he say? Yesterday we discussed the fact that he's the person who described the Constitution as having dignified and efficient parts. So the dignified parts of the constitutions are the monarchy and the House of Lords, and the efficient parts are the House of Commons and the Cabinet. And basically with Bagehot, this became the efficient parts were the moment in which people who understood the working of the Constitution were rationally deferential to it. So basically were basing their deference to the Constitution on independent choice. And those who are actually looking up to the dignified parts of the Constitution, especially to the crown, and thinking that it was really the Queen who was reigning, those were still using a type of irrational deference towards the Constitution. And in their case, it was really based on traditions and customs. So with Walter Bagehot, what you've got is an understanding of deference, which is so political, that's the first thing, hierarchical, because it is based on a historical origin in which you've got a hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. And that hierarchy in this, I mean, you could actually have in this hierarchical structure, you could have involuntary deference, but this is really coercive. That's, would be illiberal. But basically what I was really focused on was hierarchical, voluntary deference. And within voluntary deference, you've got two types: irrational deference related to the dignified parts, and rational deference related to the efficient parts. And so once you've got this sort of split in which you've got rational and irrational deference, then you realize that it is at the heart of the structure of the uncodified Constitution. So said like this, it's rather boring. And it's very difficult to for you to understand this without me having a blackboard to actually understand what I mean. But basically, for you to understand where I'm going, is that if you think about political deference, you've got two ways of thinking about it. You've got hierarchical deference for societies in which you still have got, for example, the monarchy. This is the case of Britain. Or you could actually have egalitarian deference, which is Republican instruction. Basically, this, you could use the example of the United States of America. Basically, the equal start, what is different between the United States of America and Britain is the fact that you start with, in the United States of America, an equal starting position. You decide that you create your society on equality. Okay, this is what Tocqueville describes about the United States of America. So basically, this is egalitarian deference. It's democratic by nature. It is going to be based on independent choice. Whereas if you take Britain and you've got a structure of power,
not to worry,
a structure of power which has been created out of a hierarchical structure, how do you move out of this hierarchical structure in order to reach what is going to be a democratic structure?
Okay.
And so this was my main starting point, is that Britain in the end, even though it has kept a monarchy, has still been able to become democratic in nature. And how has this happened? So this, in fact, is this story. But it is a story of little stories, because, in fact, it's not a linear story. So basically, if you take rational deference, this is, in fact, based on independent choice. It's going to be based on a sort of a number of people who are the common, the whole of, the traditional Englishman who is going to like his freedom. Those are people who are going to accept that they are going to defer willingly to the crown and the institutions. And they are not submitting because they are yielding. They are not deferring because, in fact, they are dominated. They are deferring because basically it is based on their social mores. It is based on the fact that this is not paternalistic, it is not pejorative. Basically, it is a reciprocal obligation, is that you give power in order for the elite in power to actually give you something in return. And so therefore, in that hierarchical structure, it is possible to create democratic institutions. And so I started with Bagehot. But then I moved on throughout the century. So if you take, for example, a very important constitutional lawyer such as Dicey, A.V. Dicey, A.V. Dicey is the one who is always referred to because, in fact, he's the one who carried on saying that what mattered in the British Constitution was the sovereignty of Parliament. And Dicey wrote, a very important book at the end of the 19th century in which he very clearly explained that there were three pillars in the English Constitution. There was sovereignty of Parliament, the rule of law, and there were constitutional conventions, so basically unwritten rules. But Dicey never realized that, in fact, this is only possible if you've got the fourth pillar, which is deference. If you haven't got people who are going to defer to the rule of law, if you haven't got people who are going to defer to parliamentary sovereignty, and if you haven't got people who are going to agree to constitutional conventions, your three pillars are not going to be stable. And so basically, without knowing it, Dicey willingly accepts the definition of water budget without making a great fuss out of it, but basically it's there. Deference is there like the sort of glue, like the sort of air in which, in fact, the Constitution is able to hold on four pillars and not three. And so then, in fact, from then on, I realized that why had nobody noticed this? Because it's like the air, it's like the glue. Nobody actually really cares about how an uncodified structure holds, but it holds on the social mores of the nation. And this is really what really truly affected me, because basically I'm a Victorianist. So of course, studying this in the 19th century meant that suddenly I thought to myself, why didn't I see this before? And the other thing is that I hadn't seen is that there was another person who actually used the concept of deference, but it hadn't been noticed, was Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli, the way he used it at the beginning, just when he became basically a politician, what he did. So Benjamin Disraeli, for you to remember, the dates, again, you have to check them, but 1804, and he died in 1881, and he was prime minister twice throughout the 19th century. So 1867, just after, 1868, just after the Reform Act. And again, he was prime minister from 1874 to 1880. And so he was really a conservative in the sense that he really understood that, in fact, in a parliamentary structure, you could only actually hold power if you held your party. And so he understood that the constitutional machineries of parties had to be extremely organized in order for the members of parliament in parliament to agree with the policy of the party. So basically, what Disraeli was saying about the constitution is that you could have a type of popular constitutionalism, which would be rational deference. So this popular constitutionalism was based on people who actually understood how power was functioning and would actually agree to defer to an elite who would actually have reciprocal duties towards them. But he also understood that there was this sort of irrational deference, which was based on this official constitutionalism, based on traditions and customs, etc., that we could call Whig deference, if you prefer. Okay, and basically, Benjamin Disraeli really focused on this rational deference, on this popular constitutionalism. And what I realized is that essentially throughout the 20th century, what was happening was that this historical structure of the Constitution was slowly moving out of a hierarchical structure, but still keeping the hierarchical mores, and becoming a much more legal structure. So you can see the English Constitution become, now I call it the Anglo-British Constitution, becoming much more legalized, especially after joining the European Economic Community in 1973, and accepting a number of laws into a system which therefore would actually bring in and give more power to the judges. And I realized that basically, at the end of the 20th century and in the 21st century, what had happened is that basically you had a structure which was still aristocratic in nature, but which had become democratic, but at the same time, which had still not moved out of this hierarchical structure. And that's the part of the problem, I think, today in the 21st century with Brexit. So I don't know if I've made myself clear enough. it's a bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a complicated book, but it's a bit of a sort of a sociological, constitutional, political, philosophical, reflection on the character of the Anglo-British Constitution. And a lot has been done on the Anglo-British Constitution, because basically, of course, today the main question is, do you codify the Constitution or not? So.
Oh, I've got a bunch of questions. I think I should have interrupted you before, because I've got three at least that I'd like to ask you. So one is, the first one I had was, is deference the key to legitimacy in the English system?
I believe this is the case.
Okay.
I think that essentially it is the key, it is a sort of glue to understand how you can have political legitimacy from the people towards parliamentary power, basically. Because, you know, I come to this question as a French person. And I come to this question as somebody who is coming from a country in which everything is extremely rational, and in which if you are actually going to have a constitution, you're going to write it down and everything is going to be written. So you know exactly, it's not the same starting point. And the thing is, I've said so to the students, but marrying an Englishman more than nearly 25 years ago now, I realized on a regular basis that we were never coming from the same starting point. That I would rationalize things by saying, this is the law and you move on to this way. And he would say, no, you move from actually thinking what is common sense to transforming this into law. And the thing is, you can actually see this problem in Brexit. That at the time, I remember having that conversation with the students, is that you can really see it in the way in which they came to the negotiation table. I mean, you can look at Michel Barnier. He started thinking rationally how the step-by-step approach to the negotiation would take place. And this was rationally, theoretically thought. Whereas on the other side, what you had with David Davis was coming to the table thinking, okay, what do we want? And then how do we transfer this into basically a document which is going to make sense? And in fact, you've got a collision course. It doesn't work because essentially you've got two different ways of understanding power. And that's the reason why I think that it was impossible for the British to carry on with the European project, because in fact it is a rational, theoretical project which grades according to their common sense, pragmatic way of doing politics.
That's interesting, because I mean, I have one foot sort of in political philosophy and the other one in international relations, and I was reading a course last year on the peace of the Vienna peace settlement after the Napoleonic Wars, and I looked a lot into Castlereagh
Yes.
and how he approached foreign policy, the role of Britain in the continent, the tensions he was he was in the no man's land because Metternich and the other European powers, the Russians, the Prussians, would not really understand what he was on about. But he wouldn't be able to really communicate the needs of the peace settlement in the continent with the British cabinet at the same time. So he was constantly juggling with what are the needs for a peace in Europe, how to bring France again into the table of great powers, which was something that of course didn't happen after the First World War. And he ends up slitting his throat for other purposes and internal issues and so on. But this tension that he lives, and he was quite brilliant in how he described and organized the peace with Metternich. And I was very well aware when all of this was started in 2016. For example, my father, who's English, he's half English, half Scottish, but he was a very strong Brexiteer from the beginning, because he really understood the European Union long before 2016 as something superimposed and, very rigid and not permitting any flexibility and all of these other problems that we had, and sort of he would rationalize it, but it was I think I came to become I would say, a libertarian by just listening to my dad going off in the table in lunch and sort of bashing government and everything, but out of a temperamental, not really from a philosophical sort of positivist construction of how it should be, but as an assault on our ancient liberties sort of thing. But it was something that was nearly in his blood, you could understand when he was talking about it. He didn't really need to defer to any author, or he wouldn't relate to Edmund Burke or anything which you've read, but he wouldn't think that's necessary.
But I think that that's really what politics is all about. That basically politics is not only actually having read or understanding the great authors and the ways in which they would, for example, question legitimacy. It's really looking at the ways in which the social mores of a nation are going to correspond to their political institutions. And in this sense, I really must say that I think that Walter Bagehot has really got a point. Bagehot has got a number of wrong points, okay? But I mean, when he actually says that basically a constitution should actually be based on the national character of a nation. And so what Bagehot is also making clear, of course, Bagehot is English, and what he's thinking about is the Anglo-British Constitution. But basically what is also happening there, I think, is the fact that the United Kingdom was already I mean, a union. So it was very difficult for a union to actually superimpose over itself a European Union, which was a political project theoretically thought about by nations which are very different in constitution and in nature of the British, which themselves are already also very different to each other if you take the four nations. So I think that this is, I think, the main problem, and I've been struggling in France trying to explain why it is not surprising that Brexit took place. I myself was truly devastated that Brexit happened, because for me, I truly believed that the European Union would be better and was better with the UK at the heart of it, because the UK did complain, but always often played according to the rules of the game. And I felt that also it was a very important country at the heart of the Franco-German couple. And that once they're gone, and also, I mean, however much a character like Nigel Farage was complicated and was perhaps very populist, he was saying a number of things that perhaps the European Union should have listened to, and which a number of people are actually saying, but it's just that it is not socially acceptable to say those things. And so I did feel that there was perhaps there is I think for us, in the European Union, there is a major sadness. But I mean, in the end, however much it's complicated to have seen the United Kingdom leaving, I do fundamentally understand why this happened. And especially even more so with my book, by writing the book, in fact.
Okay, I've got two other questions. I was fascinated by what you were explaining about rational and irrational deference. And my question has to do with what happens in republicanism, because I can really understand after our conversation yesterday why this irrational element is important, why we mustn't, as you were saying, quoting Bagehot, put sunlight onto magic, which was a wonderful quote. But what happens with republicanism? Is it all rational? Don't the Americans or the French have irrational deference of any kind? So
you're asking the question which should actually be the sequel to this project.
Okay.
Because I mean, I don't know whether or not I will do it, because I mean, I study British history, so I mean, however much I love studying French and American history, I would have to have this you know, this sort of this true love because in fact the only reason why I study British history is because and the British Constitution, because I truly love it. Okay, there is something in it which I find extremely appealing, and also because I don't understand it, I want to understand it. Whereas in fact, because I'm French and because I do understand the Republican structure a lot better, I find it slightly less interesting. But I think that you've got a real point, that egalitarian deference or Republican deference is mainly rational, but the reality is that it's not exactly the case. I mean, writing the book, for example, I found an extraordinary book which had been written on political deference in America in the 19th century. And what you've got is this author writing about antebellum America and saying that that deference to what had been British was still in existence in the 19th century. So, for example, you've got the son of Queen Victoria visiting the United States of America. And all the Americans, you know, are falling head over heels about the fact that the English accent is so English, that they dress differently, that, you know, it's extraordinary. But the reason why, in fact, they defer to this is not because, in fact, they defer to it because this is English. They defer to the fact that they as a nation exist because they were able to detach themselves from it. And so essentially there is a sort of irrational deference, but it is only, it's not based on traditions and customs because essentially it's not there, but it is based on the fact that it reminds them that they are rationally deferential. And so it's much more complicated, and you can find this in the French. You can find this in the French with, for example, a sort of love and hate affair with what remains of a certain type of aristocracy in France. But you would actually only, you might differ or not, but it will certainly remind you of the fact that you've overtaken this. And so what dominates is, in fact, basically your rational decision whether or not you actually want to defer to them or not. But most of the time, you're not going to do so. But there was another point about deference, perhaps which is important here, is the fact that socially speaking, the term was really, really properly explained by Edward Shields, who was a sociologist of the 1960s. And he explained extremely well that every single society is based on deference. Is that basically in every act that you do, you defer. Even an anarchist is going to defer to the readings of the people that he admires. So what Shields was saying is that in any type of political society, you have to actually accept that this is going to happen. But you can then decide that you would actually make this into a virtue of deference. That there would be a sort of ethics of deference to decide that basically you agree that in a non-codified structure, you are going to defer to what is discussion by debate. You are going to agree that you're going to have a civilized conversation, even if it is agree to disagree. Basically, what you're going to do is you are going to work within the confines of what is an ethics of deference. And that's what I think is missing today in what is essentially the after Brexit period, is that there was a rational deference which remained because basically they were rationally deferential to parliamentary sovereignty, to their country, to their mores, what they wanted to defend. It is a type of popular constitutionalism based really very much on understanding the alliance between the elite and the popular classes, but it lacks the ethics of deference. And essentially, that's the end of the book, is that deference hasn't died, and especially rational deference hasn't died. What died after Brexit, I would say at the time of the general election of 2019, is essentially irrational deference or Whig deference. It sort of died in some sort of way because Boris Johnson at the time of general election of 2019 was able to really sort of provoke a sort of political realignment in politics and to seize a sort of alliance between a certain type of Brexit elite and a certain popular vote, some of whom used to vote Labour before. But now, how do you reconstruct this? How do you reconstruct this country, this union, in a distorted situation in which the Anglo-British Constitution has been deformed by the decisions of the Blair government? And how do you actually reorganize this union? And I believe that this is possible throughout actually refinding the way in which you speak to each other through the language of civility. And it's for the British to look for it themselves, obviously enough.
Okay. Yes, I would like at the beginning, you said something that I found very interesting, and it's very much related with what you're saying now, I think. And it's the fact that you were saying that we do have an aristocratic, in the House of Lords if you want to, and monarchic mask that has been emptied or hollowed out of its powers, really, but it's just a mask that's still there. We were also talking about this yesterday, I remember. Now, the billion-dollar question, I suppose, is this, do you think that's something that can be maintained, just the mask? If we continue sort of piercing the mask from underneath, isn't just going to shamble? What do you think that's going to happen? Because, I mean, I suppose Bagehot, who studied very well the French Revolution, then the arrival of the Napoleons, and he was very much obsessed with this. He and the English were terrified with the French experiments generally, and the terror and all of that. But it's this of sort of bashing down everything, breaking violently sometimes. But maybe that's not where we are today. I don't think there's going to be any violence in this sense. But do you think that's going to happen? Do you think the masks can be maintained in this way?
I think that the main problem is that at one stage, the same way a country like France would have to do so also. But I mean, I think that politicians should look at the fact that they have still got an aristocratic structure of power in a democratic country. Mm-hmm. And so basically, the aristocratic structure of power based on the social mores has got to be properly understood in order to move on. And so basically what you've got today is that I think that Britain is trapped, is that they cannot go back to the old historical constitution, which was basically the Bagehot constitution or the dicey constitution, okay, of the 19th century. But they are not yet at the stage in which they are going to create a codified document. So they are in this sort of in-between house in which basically they've got a totally deformed constitution because of the constitutional settlement which took place under New Labour. So you mentioned this, they went through the first reform of the House of Lords, but they didn't achieve full reform. Devolution is extremely important, but in fact brought on a number of other demands, and especially the demands now for perhaps independence in the case of Scotland. Okay, but they also brought another type of questions. Okay, the reason why New Labour wanted to actually perhaps, I mean, they wanted to have a constitutional settlement, which would be for the democratic age. But basically, they reformed by stages, but they didn't fully end up the reforms. So they deformed basically the constitution, which was historical, and now it's now a constitutional structure which is extremely difficult to understand if you do not study the constitution. For example, if you're British, you're going to have several systems of voting at the time of the general election, at the time of local elections, at the time of the devolved, for the devolved assemblies. You have got very different types of ways of actually understanding power, and in the end, it becomes even more complicated for somebody who is not truly interested in politics to think, okay, how do I come about this? So you can see that, for example, at the time of the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson was thinking about having perhaps a constitutional rethink, okay, to actually perhaps have a constitutional convention in which they would get a number of constitutional lawyers and people to think about the rest. But it is no longer at the heart of what he wants to do, obviously not, because he's got other problems on his hands. So you wonder if things are not going to meander along in a very English way of, evolution without revolution. Mm. But I mean, evolution without revolution worked because, in fact, you had deference to the constitution. If you only have a sort of rational deference, which is popular and no longer based on an ethics of deference, what you're going to have is pure populism.
Yeah. That reminds me, do you remember when Tocqueville is writing his book, he's sort of obsessed about, he understands that democracy and equality is going to be on the rise. There's no going back to the old system, and aristocracy, who used to play a role in balancing out a despotic king, is not going to be available to balance a despotic majority, which is going to be main. And so he creates this sort of idea in saying that, well, we can't have the old aristocracy, but what we can have is political association. And through that, hopefully we can balance out and create some equilibrium in the system that has now been broken. Now, the British, as you've been saying, have had their own historical way into that, and they managed to translate and adapt the ideas of the time of equality, democracy, while not destroying these other elements. So I want to ask you a question, and I don't know, and it's a bigger, sort of this old question of political philosophy, which has to do with the forms of government. Because I see perfectly well that where you're going through that, this is how the English came to today, basically. It's an idea to explain reality, or today, or how we got here. But what do you think, because I really understand one of the key inputs that I always took from Tocqueville when I was discussing this with Eduardo Noya is this rage for equality, and the less inequality there is, the more it's going to get attention for. So everyone's going to be more and more angry when we have less inequality, which is something that you wouldn't really expect. You expect to have great rages when there are great inequalities, but no, you get them in societies who are really arriving at a point of equality that has not been known for the rest of history. But this is always, I find, at the heart of the criticism on the House of Lords and on the criticism on the Queen and on the institution. It's this rage for equality. But my question has to do more with forms. So you've been brought up under the French system, which is very, very, very different from the English, even though you're very close geographically. But what pros and cons could you tell our students that are going to be viewing this, maybe that come up to mind? You know, in what way Montesquieu was very good on this, so was Rousseau and many other important French thinkers. They studied the forms very much. So democracies have these problems and these advantages. Monarchies have these other ones. But if we go into the modern political systems of today, what pros and cons do you think republicanism has over a traditional parliamentary democracy and parliamentary monarchy like England, for example?
Yeah, just before I answer that question, I was thinking about what you were saying about Tocqueville, that Tocqueville actually juggles the problem of equality, as you rightly said, through the civil associations, but there's also the power of the press, obviously enough. There is the role of women, even though there is a complicated way of understanding the role of women in this case. And of course, what is going to actually juggle this sort of this super equality is a form of social conformism, which means that you better not go against society the way it is, because essentially, if not, you're not going to be part of it. So basically, for me, Tocqueville, in his understanding of the American mores, is truly doing une œuvre, okay, what would be in fact una obra, okay. He's creating what is essentially trying to explain the way in which power in a republic is going to work. So for me, and of course, what Tocqueville is saying in the 19th century, because he's looking at this with the eyes and he's of somebody who is French and who is thinking about what is happening in France at the same time. Let's not remember that Tocqueville at the time knew that after the revolution, France had gone through a number of actually, constitutional settlements which hadn't worked. And he's actually trying to understand how this could work in France. And what he's saying also is seeing is that essentially France is at a crossroads between Britain and America, because America is starting from an equal starting position. It's basically people who decide to start, what is extremely rare, okay? They start from scratch. Yeah. Whereas in fact in France, they want to start with an equal starting position, whereas the whole of their past is hierarchical. And basically, I think that the problem I can see in France is the fact that in some sort of way, we have never recovered from the revolution. Is that we refer to 1789 as the moment in which we have created our Republican way of living and our Republican values. And but basically, we are still a nation which was based on a hugely hierarchical structure. I was absolutely astounded, for example, when Notre Dame went in fire, to see the reaction of the French, and to see that on the night in which it went in fire, we were, I mean, so many people were upset. And on TV at midnight, whom did we have in front of TV? We're talking about a Republican secular country. We had the Archbishop of Paris and the president. And who spoke first? The Archbishop. I couldn't believe it. But you know why? Because fundamentally, it is our past. We are the daughter of Rome, okay? We are, that's what we are. And so basically it would be better to accept the fact that there was a hierarchical structure on which we have based new democratic equal institutions than spending our time in thinking that the constitutional moment was 1789. I think that in this sense, Britain has had its own lies, okay? The way in which the United Kingdom is able to make sense of the revolutions of the 17th century and to actually explain 1688 as the moment in which, you know, the old constitution was retrieved is a myth in itself. But still, the hierarchical structures are still there. It's now today, how do you actually get that hierarchical structure in a very democratic age to actually work out and to understand that, and this is for Republican deference too, okay, is that, and this is for all our countries, is that if we are going to live in democracies, which is a messy, it's very messy, it's a messy structure, you can only do so if you are going to appeal to an ethics of deference, in which basically deference is going to generate an equality in inequality. Mm. That's what Ceerg is saying, is that because whatever happens, you are always in a relationship of deference. You better accept an ethics of deference in which you accept that there's going to be that this is going to generate an equality in inequality. So basically, that's what we do on a regular basis, okay? A number of people are going to accept Emmanuel Macron as a president, whereas they didn't actually vote for him. You see, that's basically what democratic structures are all about. Mm-hmm. And so that's where perhaps a bigger book could be written about the role of a sort of rational egalitarian deference. But I mean, I think it's been written. There was a book which was actually written by a well-known, a lawyer who wrote about an ethics of deference, and that's exactly what he writes about. It's a very good, strong book, but basically, who wants to read this and who wants to be reminded that basically democracies can only actually function if you are tolerant and moderate, and in which you actually agree that discussion by debate is going to prevail. And that's the only way in which you're going to have liberty and equality at the same time.
Indeed.
Because that's what Badgett is saying, that Britain has chosen liberty before equality, and that France has put equality before liberty, but in the end has lost both.
Okay. Do you have the book there physically with you so you can show us?
Yeah.
Please share on the screen so we can see it. There we are. Okay, we'll see it the other way around, but yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, yes, I'd like to recommend that.
I mean, there's just one thing I wanted to add that we didn't say, is that I never wrote the book to, in the end, find myself in the conclusion justifying Brexit. And I hated it, but I had no other choice.
I started off quite surprised too, but I think everyone comes to, once you really start getting into it, everything starts making a bit more sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But still, for example, in Spain, the idea of, Spain, I feel, and this is a strong personal opinion, but I feel like because of Franco, they've always looked to Europe as sort of the future, modernity, and so on. So the idea of questioning Europe is something sort of out of the imagination. No one's going to get into the Moncloa with that kind of speech, or is going to generate something like what's happened in England. And it has to do very much, I find it's so different. And the Spaniards, and like everywhere else, I think it's always been presented like a sort of populist, irrational and stupid English who don't really know what they're doing. And I think that's not true at all, of course.
No,
but,
no, I agree in the sense that at the time I remember having a number of academic friends that I truly really like, who actually started saying that they were going to vote in favor of Brexit, and I was truly horrified. And what came out always in the press was the fact that people who had voted in favor of Brexit were uneducated, were generally living in the poor parts of Britain, and that basically didn't understand anything to politics. And here I was having a number of very good academic friends who were educated, who were not living in the poorer parts of Britain, and who understood a lot about politics. And I was very interested in what they were saying, basically in the sense that a lot of them were voting in favor of Brexit because of parliamentary sovereignty. But I mean, a lot of them also truly believed that joining the EEC in 1973 had actually pushed Britain into codifying the law in a way which they would rather had not have had, because this gave power to judges in a way in which the structure of power had not been meant to work. In a parliamentary structure, politicians decide. If you're going to pass the bucket to the judges, then in fact, the executive is undermined. And I found this extremely interesting because that was something I hadn't actually studied. But then you realize that throughout the 1970s, it was just as if the European virus had caught into the British Constitution, Constitution as a body, okay? And that essentially the British being good at actually doing things to actually think, okay, how are we going to make this work, had actually slowly but gradually codified a number of things, or had transformed a number of laws, which actually had given a huge amount of power to certain judges, but also had actually really truly undermined parliamentary sovereignty. And so it took a very long time to people to understand that. But I think that what happened at the time of Brexit was that a number of people did understand exactly what had happened. And this had actually been said by a number of politicians in the 1960s. If you take, for example, Hugh Gaitskell, who used to be the leader of the Labour Party in the 1960s, he wrote that very famous speech in which he said that this joining the EEC would be the end of 1,000 years of history. And of course, this was on the left. But then on the right, you had people like Enoch Powell, who were saying that, of course, an extremely complicated figure, but who were saying basically what most Brexiteers were saying in 2016, which is that there was something in the very theoretical structure of the political project, or the European project, which was anathema to the British Constitution. And by writing the book, I was forced to get into those debates, and I was actually quite struck by how history repeats itself. Is that basically the same type of arguments were given again. It's just that in 2016, they were given by a number of people who felt that they had been bullied into the political project of the European Union. And however much I hated this way of talking, I mean, at the same time, it is fair to accept that perhaps a country has got a right to say this. It's just if they are going to say so. So yeah, I was also very upset about the ways in which the vote took place. That if we are really fair, for example, British citizens on the continent were not allowed to vote, which I thought was totally unfair. I also felt that with the scandal of Cambridge Analytica, the way in which the digital age had transformed politics was truly dangerous. That's by serving a ready-made, simple message, you could actually really convince people of anything. And so it was really deranged. I mean, I was really, no, not deranged, not the right term, dérangé in French. I was really upset about basically what had happened.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going on a bit.
No, it's okay. We have to close because it's going to chuck us out in a couple of minutes anyway. So Catherine, I don't know if you'd like to say some final words of the book or your course here or anything you'd like to say?
No, I just like to say that it sounds like a crazy book, and it is in many ways, but I mean, it is a journey. And so basically, if you are interested in the concept and in the constitution and Brexit, perhaps it's interesting, but just thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
It will be very interesting for me, so thank you. So Catherine, thank you so much. I know it's been very complicated from you having to Zoom late at night to be with our students here. And I've chucked you into 2 videos in 2 days, which I know is stressing, getting into Instagram, everything. I know I've sort of pushed you out of anything that's relaxing and comfortable, so I'm sorry for that. And I'm thankful at the same time.
I've learned a lot. Thank you very much, Will.
Me too.
Sorry, keep going. And I'd like to say thank you to all of you who've been listening and who joined. Because,
okay.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Take care.